The day started like any other on my sprawling ranch, the kind of property where the horizon stretches endlessly and the quiet hum of nature dominates. I was inspecting the newly planted fields when I noticed an unusual smell in the air, faint at first, but unmistakable: raw sewage. My heart sank. Something was terribly wrong. I followed the scent across the ranch, feet crunching on dry dirt, eyes scanning for the source. That's when I saw it. Bright orange warning flags marking freshly dug trenches that sliced directly across my land. Pipes lay exposed, half buried in mounds of soil. The realization hit me instantly: someone had laid sewer lines illegally, and they weren't subtle about it. And then I saw her. Standing at the far edge of the trench, clipboard in hand, clipboard shadowed by the blazing sun, was none other than Linda. Everyone calls her HOA Karen. She wore that same smug expression that screams, "I make the rules," as if the universe existed only to enforce her whims. She was measuring, gesturing, even snapping photos like some kind of bureaucratic warlord proud of her conquest. I didn't approach immediately. Instead, I observed, letting the absurdity sink in. My land, my property rights, my environmental responsibility trampled, and she didn't even know the storm she had stepped into. The audacity of it was breathtaking. She had clearly assumed that because she wielded HOA authority, she could disregard every law, every regulation, and every consequence that might exist beyond her narrow world. I finally stepped forward, hands open, calm but firm. "Linda," I said, my voice carrying across the trench. "What exactly are you doing here?" Her response was immediate, defensive, filled with that familiar, condescending tone. She claimed it was an approved community project, that the HOA had authority to manage waste and sewer systems for neighborhood compliance. She didn't pause, didn't even consider that she might be treading on federal regulations. That's when I decided it was time to let reality speak. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my ID, and held it up between us. The words fell slowly, deliberately, letting the weight settle: "I'm the director of the EPA." For a brief moment, the air seemed to freeze. Birds stopped chirping. The distant hum of machinery seemed to falter. Her confident smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of genuine fear. The power dynamic had shifted. The woman who thought she ruled the neighborhood now realized she had underestimated the authority she was challenging. The pipes, the trenches, the illegal work — it wasn't just a violation of HOA norms. It was a federal offense, and she had walked straight into the consequences. Neighbors peeked from their windows, drawn by the commotion. Phones were already out. Cameras capturing every moment. I stayed calm, letting her squirm under the weight of truth, knowing this confrontation would not only expose her recklessness but also teach everyone watching that real authority demands respect and accountability. Linda froze, her hands clutching the clipboard like a lifeline. For the first time, the woman who had dictated neighborhood rules with smug certainty realized that she had no idea who she was dealing with. The weight of the words hung in the air: EPA director, and her bravado started to crumble. I didn't know," she stammered, the voice that usually commanded obedience now wavering. "I thought this project had HOA approval." I didn't think. She trailed off, eyes darting between me, the trenches, and the pipes she'd just laid. Her panic was palpable, but it didn't absolve her. Federal jurisdiction wasn't something that could be negotiated with excuses. I stepped closer, calm but firm, my boots crunching against the loose soil. "Linda, these pipes are a direct violation of multiple environmental laws," I said. "You've contaminated private property, potentially endangered groundwater, and bypassed permits that protect every resident here. This isn't about HOA rules anymore. This is federal." Her eyes widened, and she took a small step back. I could see the gears turning in her mind, scrambling for a plausible escape route. She thought HOA bylaws gave her limitless authority. She had assumed small-scale power in a community equated to control over federal regulations. She had never faced someone who could enforce real consequences. Until now. Neighbors began to gather at the edges of my property, some filming discreetly on their phones. I ignored them, focusing solely on her. Public opinion mattered, but enforcement was my priority. I instructed her to immediately stop work and leave the property. The tone of my voice left no room for debate. She obeyed reluctantly, dragging her equipment behind her, muttering under her breath, trying to maintain some semblance of dignity. Once she had cleared the trench, I examined the pipes. The work was amateurish, improperly sealed joints, shallow burial depth, and materials unsuitable for sewage transport. I took photographs for documentation. Every mistake she made would strengthen any potential case against her, whether civil or criminal. After the immediate danger passed, I walked the trench line, noting how far the contamination could have spread. It wasn't catastrophic yet, but without remediation, the consequences could be severe. I made a mental checklist of steps: testing, reporting, cleanup, and follow UPS with local authorities to ensure compliance. No shortcuts. No room for error. By sunset, Linda had returned to her neighborhood, visibly shaken and unusually quiet. The story was already spreading through whispers and phone videos. She had underestimated not only my authority but the awareness of the residents she sought to intimidate. That mistake would haunt her for months. Sometimes, power isn't measured by how loudly you assert it, but by how quietly you enforce it. And that afternoon, the lesson was crystal clear. The next morning, I began coordinating a formal inspection of the ranch. I wanted a clear record of everything Linda had done: the trenches, the pipes, the soil displacement, and any potential contamination. While walking the property with my team, I reflected on just how bold she had been. Most people respect boundaries when they know authority exists. Linda seemed to think HOA titles gave her immunity. The environmental hazards were subtle but significant. Even shallow sewer pipes can leach bacteria, chemicals, and waste into the surrounding soil and groundwater. If left unchecked, nearby wells and streams could be affected. I documented everything meticulously, snapping photographs and collecting soil samples for lab analysis. Every detail would matter if legal action became necessary. Meanwhile, word of the incident had spread through the neighborhood. Curious residents began showing up at the edges of the ranch, some cautiously, some boldly. They whispered to one another, pointing toward the trenches, taking out phones. It was both reassuring and concerning. Reassuring because people finally realized the seriousness of the situation, concerning because attention could interfere with the remediation process. I paused to address a few neighbors. I appreciate your concern, but please stay back. This is a controlled process. We need to ensure everything is handled safely. Their nods and cautious retreat demonstrated that respect, when coupled with authority, carries more weight than fear ever could. The lesson wasn't lost on anyone watching. Back at the trenches, I noticed several areas where the pipes had not been connected properly. There were visible gaps and weak joints, creating immediate risks for leakage. My team and I marked each location, noting depth, angle, and potential environmental impact. We also began assessing the proper method to remove the pipes safely and restore the land to a compliant state. By midday, I had contacted local environmental authorities to notify them of the incident officially. While I had the authority to act, transparency was important. Federal oversight could reinforce compliance and demonstrate that reckless actions even by someone in an HOA position have consequences. Later, I reviewed the HOA regulations themselves. They were vague, poorly enforced, and nowhere near sufficient to prevent a situation like this. Linda had exploited every loophole, thinking procedural gaps in a small governing body would shield her from federal law. She had miscalculated spectacularly. As the sun began to set, I walked the perimeter once more. The pipes glinted faintly in the golden light, a reminder of audacity meeting authority. Linda had assumed she could impose her will without consequence. She had been wrong. And the neighborhood was now witnessing what accountability truly looked like. Sometimes, a single act of recklessness can reveal the true character of a person and the true weight of the law. Linda was about to learn both. By the following day, the story had reached every corner of the neighborhood. Social media posts, group chats, and whispered conversations all mentioned the audacity of HOA Karen and her ill-fated sewer project. Videos from curious neighbors circulated, showing the trenches, the pipes, and her flustered retreat. She had underestimated not only me but the community's awareness. I spent the morning reviewing the collected soil samples and water tests. Preliminary results confirmed what I had feared: untreated sewage had already begun seeping into shallow soil layers. Immediate remediation was necessary to prevent any long-term environmental damage. I coordinated with my EPA team to bring in specialists, containment equipment, and proper disposal protocols. This was serious, and mistakes would not be tolerated. Meanwhile, Linda had contacted the HOA board, claiming she was acting in the community's best interest and that I had overreacted. I wasn't surprised. Her arrogance had a predictable pattern: deny, shift blame, and hope the opposition lacked the authority or the knowledge to hold her accountable. She didn't realize I had both. I called a meeting with the HOA board, explaining the legal and environmental ramifications of her actions. I emphasized that their bylaws could never override federal law. Some board members tried to downplay her actions, framing it as a misunderstanding, but once I presented evidence, photos, and preliminary soil reports, their faces changed. Reality doesn't negotiate with excuses. Linda appeared at the meeting, attempting to defend herself with rehearsed talking points. I allowed her a moment to speak, then calmly addressed every false claim, countering each with proof, regulations, and authority. The room was silent, her bravado stripped away by facts. The board could no longer ignore the severity of the situation or her negligence. After the meeting, I oversaw the initial stages of pipe removal. My team worked carefully, ensuring that each section of pipe was properly extracted, sealed, and disposed of according to federal environmental standards. Watching the pipes come out of the ground, I reflected on how easily someone's ignorance or arrogance can threaten both private property and public safety. By sunset, most of the illegal installations had been removed. The trenches were partially backfilled, soil stabilized, and warning signs placed to prevent further disturbance. Linda lingered in the background, silent, realizing the depth of the consequences she had triggered. Authority, she now understood, is not something one can fake or bend to ego. That evening, I walked the property alone. The wind carried the faint scent of disturbed earth, a reminder that some mistakes leave marks longer than visible damage. And in this case, the lesson was unmistakable: audacity without knowledge and without accountability always comes at a price. By the next morning, I began coordinating the full environmental remediation plan. My team and I mapped every affected section of the ranch, noting soil contamination, drainage patterns, and potential runoff points. Every inch of land mattered. Improper handling could create long-term ecological consequences, not just inconvenience for me. I also contacted local water authorities to alert them to the possible contamination, ensuring that no nearby wells or streams had been affected. Preventive action was essential. This wasn't about punishment, it was about protecting both private property and public health. The seriousness of the situation underscored how reckless HOA Karen's actions had been. Meanwhile, Linda had started circulating excuses among neighborhood residents, claiming that she had been following HOA protocol and that I had overreacted. I ignored the noise, knowing that evidence and proper procedure would speak louder than words. It was almost amusing to see how quickly people began questioning her credibility once the facts were visible. I held a follow-up meeting with the HOA board to review the legal consequences of their former members' actions. I outlined fines, federal implications, and potential liability issues, making it clear that no one, not even HOA leadership, was exempt from compliance with environmental regulations. Their earlier smug confidence had vanished, replaced by urgent nods and scribbled notes. Throughout the day, I oversaw the trench excavation and pipe removal. Each pipe was carefully labeled, logged, and safely disposed of according to federal protocols. Specialists used protective gear and precise methods to prevent any further contamination. The work was meticulous, slow, and necessary. One mistake could undo hours of careful planning. Neighbors continued to watch from a distance, some whispering, some filming. The spectacle drew attention, but also reinforced the lesson: audacity without knowledge and disregard for law has consequences that even the most confident cannot escape. Linda's panic was a live demonstration of that truth. By mid-afternoon, the last major section of pipe was removed. Trenches were partially backfilled, and soil stabilization measures were implemented to prevent erosion. My team also began testing runoff areas to ensure no residual contamination persisted. When I finally took a step back and surveyed the property, I realized how lucky the situation could have been. If the pipes had leaked more extensively, the damage might have been irreparable. Instead, careful oversight, authority, and preparation had mitigated the worst outcomes. Linda, for her part, remained at the edges of the property, silent, hands fidgeting. The confident woman who had imposed her will just days before now understood the reality of accountability and the limits of her own power. By evening, the ranch was quiet again, though the traces of the chaos remained: partially filled trenches, disturbed soil, and the faint lingering scent of sewage. It was a reminder that actions have consequences, and some lessons are learned only through experience and oversight. I gathered my team for a debrief. We reviewed the day's progress, documented every step, and planned the next phase: full soil testing and long-term remediation. I emphasized precision. Cutting corners wasn't an option, even when the immediate threat seemed contained. Environmental responsibility requires diligence, patience, and accountability. Meanwhile, word of HOA Karen's misadventure had spread beyond the neighborhood. Social media posts showed snippets of the trenches, the pipes, and her stunned reaction when confronted. Some posts exaggerated the story for humor, others highlighted the seriousness of violating federal regulations. The combination made her a cautionary tale, and the neighborhood began discussing ways to prevent such reckless authority from ever returning. That evening, I met briefly with the HOA board once more. They were anxious, but cooperative. I walked them through federal guidelines, emphasizing the difference between HOA authority and regulatory law. Some members expressed surprise at how easily their neighbor had overstepped. I reminded them, ignorance doesn't absolve responsibility. Understanding the law and respecting it is the only safeguard. Back at the ranch, I inspected the trenches again. Each section of soil had been carefully stabilized, with temporary warning markers for safety. I tested drainage patterns and ensured that runoff flowed away from wells, streams, and sensitive areas. The work was painstaking, but essential. Improper oversight at this stage could undo all the efforts we had made. Neighbors peeked from the edges of their property, whispering and occasionally snapping photos. I didn't object. Part of the lesson was public: people needed to witness accountability in action. Power unchecked can embolden recklessness, authority responsibly exercised demonstrates consequences. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood alone near the largest trench. The glow of evening light softened the harshness of the disturbed land, yet the lesson remained clear. HOA Karen had thought rules were hers to bend. She had failed to recognize the limits of her authority. And in doing so, she had triggered federal oversight that could not be ignored. I thought about how often people misunderstand power. Authority without knowledge is dangerous, knowledge without accountability is incomplete. Linda had embodied the first. I had embodied the second. And the outcome, as it always does, reflected which type of authority truly matters. By nightfall, the ranch was secure, the pipes removed, and the lesson delivered without escalation or violence, just the quiet, unyielding weight of responsibility. The following morning, I began reviewing the remediation plan with my environmental specialists. Each soil sample, each trench location, and each drainage test was meticulously documented. My goal wasn't punishment, it was prevention. I needed to ensure that no residual contamination could affect the ranch, neighbors, or the wider ecosystem. Every detail mattered. Meanwhile, Linda attempted to contact the HOA board, pleading her case and claiming she had acted in the best interest of the community. The board, now fully aware of the federal implications, barely responded. The arrogance she once wielded as a weapon had vanished, replaced with a quiet panic. Authority had limits, and she had overstepped them spectacularly. I spent the morning walking the property with a junior EPA officer, showing him the lessons inherent in this kind of violation. Improperly laid sewer pipes aren't just a minor mistake, they can threaten groundwater, soil stability, and public health. We discussed every step, from documentation to remediation, emphasizing that diligence prevents small errors from becoming disasters. Neighbors had started to approach again, this time asking questions about the process, the potential risks, and the expected outcomes. I spoke calmly, explaining the steps we were taking and why federal oversight exists. Their trust in proper authority grew, while Linda's narrative lost credibility. People could now see the difference between reckless assumptions of power and responsible enforcement of law. By midday, the trenches were almost fully stabilized. Soil was backfilled, vegetation markers were in place, and runoff channels had been carefully monitored. Specialists ran additional tests on nearby water sources to ensure no contamination had migrated beyond the property. Every precaution was taken to restore the ranch to its original state and prevent further environmental hazards. Later, the HOA board formally suspended Linda from any neighborhood authority pending further review. The decision was unanimous. Without her, the neighborhood would operate under clearly defined rules, and any future overreach would face scrutiny. The message was clear: ignorance and arrogance are not shields against accountability. As evening approached, I walked the ranch alone. The trenches, though repaired, stood as a reminder of the audacity some people possess when they assume unchecked authority. Yet the land itself seemed to breathe a little easier now, restored under careful oversight. This was not just remediation, it was a lesson delivered to the entire community. Linda's fate, for now, was sealed. The arrogance that had fueled her actions had collided with real authority, and the consequences were unavoidable. Her misjudgment would be remembered not as a minor HOA dispute but as a cautionary tale about the limits of power and the weight of responsibility. By the next week, the ranch was fully stabilized, the trenches filled, and all illegal pipes removed. Soil tests confirmed no lingering contamination, and runoff channels were clear. The property was safe, restored, and compliant with all environmental regulations. It was a relief but also a reminder of how close things had come to becoming a disaster. The HOA had begun implementing reforms. New guidelines clarified the limits of authority, required federal compliance checks for any environmental projects, and mandated oversight for community initiatives. The board understood that Linda's reckless actions had exposed both them and the neighborhood to potential legal and financial liability. Mistakes like this were no longer tolerated. Linda, meanwhile, had retreated entirely from neighborhood affairs. Her confidence had been shattered, and her excuses no longer carried weight. Residents who had once feared her now whispered about her recklessness, sharing videos and stories that highlighted the difference between arrogance and responsibility. She had become a cautionary tale in real time. I spent the week reviewing every part of the ranch affected by the incident, ensuring that mitigation had been thorough. Water sources were tested again, soil layers inspected, and drainage checked for potential contamination paths. Each step was documented meticulously. This record would serve as both protection and education for anyone attempting similar actions in the future. Neighbors occasionally stopped by to ask questions. I explained procedures, shared lessons about environmental responsibility, and emphasized that authority doesn't give immunity from federal law. The reaction was encouraging. People wanted to understand, to prevent future incidents, and to see proper enforcement in action. The lesson had gone beyond punishment, it had educated a community. At the same time, I reflected on the broader implications. Power without knowledge is dangerous. Ignorance combined with arrogance can create severe consequences not just for the perpetrator, but for everyone nearby. Linda had learned that lesson the hard way. The neighborhood learned it through observation. And I reinforced it through careful, calm enforcement. By the weekend, the ranch was peaceful. Birds sang, crops swayed gently in the wind, and the smell of fresh earth replaced the faint traces of sewage. Everything was restored, not just physically, but symbolically, authority balanced with responsibility, power restrained by knowledge, and accountability firmly established. Walking the property alone at sunset, I realized the incident had become more than a confrontation. It had become a lesson in civics, environmental responsibility, and human behavior. Some people act first and think later until the law, or life, teaches them otherwise. By the time Chapter 9 began, the ranch had returned to its serene state, but the lessons of that chaotic week were etched into every corner of the property. The trenches, now filled and stabilized, stood as quiet reminders of what reckless authority could do when left unchecked. The pipes were gone, but the story lingered. I spent the morning conducting a final inspection, walking each section of the ranch and double-checking all remediation measures. Water tests, soil samples, and drainage channels all came back clean. My team and I documented every detail for the official record, ensuring that if any future disputes arose, the evidence would be clear, indisputable, and transparent. Meanwhile, Linda had disappeared from neighborhood activities entirely. Her attempts to justify her actions had been thoroughly discredited. No HOA title, no clipboard, no master plan could override federal law or mitigate the mistakes she had made. Residents whispered about her recklessness, sharing videos and accounts that highlighted how close she had come to creating an environmental disaster. She had learned, painfully, the limits of her influence. The HOA board, now fully aware of their responsibility, implemented reforms to prevent any similar incidents. New protocols required federal oversight for environmental projects, stricter approval processes, and transparent communication with residents. The community, once intimidated, now felt empowered. They had witnessed the consequences of arrogance firsthand, and they understood that accountability is non-negotiable. For me, the incident reinforced the importance of measured authority. True power isn't in enforcing rules blindly or intimidating others, it's in ensuring compliance with laws, protecting the environment, and teaching lessons through action rather than confrontation. HOA Karen had assumed control without understanding the consequences. I had acted quietly, deliberately, and responsibly. The contrast spoke volumes. By evening, I walked the ranch alone, taking in the sights and sounds of a property restored. Birds sang, fields swayed gently, and the land felt at peace once more. The physical restoration mirrored the broader lesson: reckless audacity can disrupt lives, but careful, informed authority restores balance. Reflecting on the past days, I realized the story wasn't just about sewer pipes or HOA overreach. It was about understanding limits, respecting regulations, and recognizing the real weight of responsibility. Authority without knowledge is dangerous, knowledge without accountability is incomplete. Together, they create balance. The ranch was quiet. Linda's lesson was clear. The neighborhood had witnessed it. And the land itself, restored and secure, silently testified to the power of patience, knowledge, and deliberate action. Some people act first and think later, but when authority meets accountability, truth always prevails. If you loved this story and want more jaw-dropping real-life HOA and authority confrontations, Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Drop a comment below. Have you ever dealt with someone like HOA Karen? And don't forget to like the video if the story shocked you as much as it shocked me.